Sarah Mitchell walked into Jefferson High's cafeteria carrying a lunch tray and wearing the same nervous smile every transfer student had worn before her. The whispers followed her like shadows: another military brat, another outsider who wouldn't last the semester. What none of them knew was that 3 months earlier, this ordinary 17-year-old had been deep in the mountains of Afghanistan, completing a classified mission that would remain buried in government files for the next 50 years. The bullies saw easy prey. The teachers saw another student to worry about. Her classmates saw someone to ignore or torment. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any new girl. She was a weapon forged in silence, trained by the deadliest forces on Earth. And now she was about to discover that high school could be just as dangerous as any battlefield she'd ever faced. Some secrets are kept to protect the world. Others are kept to protect the people who would never believe the truth even if they heard it. Sarah Mitchell stepped through the double doors of Jefferson High School on a gray Monday morning in October, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder and a manila folder clutched in her other hand. The hallways buzzed with the familiar chaos of teenagers rushing to first period, lockers slamming shut, and the distant echo of sneakers squeaking against polished floors. To anyone watching, she looked like every other military kid who had wandered through these halls over the years. Quiet, observant, and carrying the invisible weight of too many goodbyes.
Principal Harrison, a balding man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, walked beside her as they navigated the crowded corridor. He had seen dozens of transfer students come and go, especially from military families stationed at the nearby base, and he had developed a practiced routine for helping them settle in.
What he didn't know was that Sarah's transfer papers contained more fiction than fact, and that her previous school records had been carefully crafted by people whose job it was to make dangerous truths disappear. Jefferson High has about 800 students, Principal Harrison explained as they paused outside the main office. We pride ourselves on being inclusive and supportive of all our students, especially those from military families. I know this transition can be challenging, but I'm confident you'll find your place here. Sarah nodded politely, her green eyes scanning the hallway with a awareness that most 17-year-olds didn't possess. She cataloged exit routes, identified potential blind spots, and automatically assessed which students might pose problems. Habits that had kept her alive in places where the wrong turn could mean death. The fluorescent lighting reminded her of the makeshift classrooms in Forward Operating Base Chapman, where she had spent 3 months pretending to be a regular Army brat while actually gathering intelligence on Taliban supply routes. The morning classes passed in a blur of introductions and sideways glances from curious classmates. Sarah sat in the back corner of each room when possible, a position that allowed her to observe everyone while keeping potential threats in view. Her teachers introduced her with the same gentle encouragement they offered all new students, unaware that she had already memorized their names, backgrounds, and daily routines from the intelligence packet she had studied before arriving. In American history, Mrs. Chen asked students to share something interesting about their previous schools. When Sarah's turn came, she offered a carefully rehearsed story about attending 3 different schools in 2 years due to her father's military assignments. She spoke of missing friends and adjusting to new places, painting herself as just another displaced teenager seeking stability. The truth, that she had spent the last 6 months in specialized training facilities across 3 continents, remained locked away behind practiced smiles and manufactured memories. Lunchtime brought the real challenge. The cafeteria was a social minefield that Sarah had to navigate without the benefit of weapons training or tactical support. She selected a turkey sandwich and chocolate milk, paying with exact change while scanning the room for suitable seating. The unwritten rules of high school hierarchy were as complex as any military chain of command, and just as dangerous to violate. She chose an empty table near the windows, hoping to blend into the background while she observed the social dynamics around her. The popular kids clustered around tables in the center of the room, their laughter carrying across the space like music that everyone else wished they could join. Athletes occupied another section, their Letterman jackets serving as uniforms that marked their territory as clearly as any military insignia. It was during this careful observation that Sarah first encountered Marcus Webb and his crew. Marcus was a senior, built like a linebacker with short brown hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having his authority questioned. He approached her table with 3 other boys trailing behind him like loyal soldiers following their commanding officer. "Well, well," Marcus said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Looks like we've got fresh meat." He slid uninvited into the seat across from Sarah, his friends flanking him on either side. "I'm Marcus. I run things around here, so let me give you some friendly advice about how Jefferson High works." Sarah continued eating her sandwich, her expression neutral while her mind automatically shifted into threat assessment mode. Marcus weighed approximately 180 pounds, favored his left side slightly, probably an old football injury, and wore his class ring on his right hand.
making it a potential weapon.
His friends were followers, not leaders, which meant they would hesitate before acting independently. First rule, Marcus continued, apparently taking her silence for intimidation. New kids pay the welcome tax. Think of it as insurance.
You give me $20 every week, and I make sure nobody gives you trouble. Fair deal, right? The cafeteria had grown quieter around them, other students sensing drama and turning to watch.
Sarah finished chewing and swallowed carefully before responding in a voice that remained perfectly calm. I don't think that's necessary. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Oh, it's definitely necessary, Army brat. See, you don't understand how things work here yet. This isn't some military base where Daddy can protect you. This is my territory and everyone pays the tax. Sarah set down her sandwich and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. Her green eyes were steady and unblinking, carrying a depth that made him unconsciously shift in his seat. She had looked into the eyes of men who had killed without hesitation, who had planned attacks on innocent civilians, who had threatened her with torture and death. A high school bully, no matter how intimidating he might seem to his classmates, didn't even register as a minor threat. I said no, she repeated quietly. The tension at the table was palpable now, drawing attention from across the cafeteria. Marcus's face reddened, his reputation on the line in front of his audience. He leaned forward aggressively, invading Sarah's personal space in a way that was meant to frighten and dominate. Listen here, new girl, he hissed. You can do this the easy way or the hard way.
But either way, you're going to pay. And Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled.
In her peripheral vision, she noted the locations of every person in the immediate area, calculated the distance to the nearest exit, and identified 3 different objects that could serve as improvised weapons if the situation escalated.
Her body language gave away nothing of these preparations. The hard way it is, Marcus said, reaching across the table as if to grab her wrist. What happened next lasted less than 2 seconds, but it would be replayed in whispered conversations for weeks afterward. Sarah's hand moved with fluid precision, intercepting Marcus's wrist and applying pressure to a specific point that sent shooting pain up his arm. Her other hand remained casually positioned near her lunch tray, as if she hadn't moved at all. To observers, it looked like Marcus had simply reached across the table and then jerked his hand back with a surprised yelp. Oh, did you hurt yourself? Sarah asked with genuine-sounding concern, releasing his wrist immediately. You should be more careful reaching across tables like that. Marcus cradled his hand, confusion and anger warring across his features.
He couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't understand how a simple grab had turned into excruciating pain. His friends looked equally baffled, unsure whether their leader had been hurt or embarrassed.
What did you do? Marcus demanded, his voice rising. I didn't do anything, Sarah replied innocently. You reached across the table and pulled your hand back. Maybe you strained something? She turned to address his friends with apparent helpfulness. You guys should make sure he gets to the nurse if it keeps hurting. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period and providing a convenient exit from the confrontation. Students began clearing their tables and moving toward their next classes, the drama already becoming yesterday's news in the rapid-fire attention span of high school social life. Tara gathered her belongings and stood to leave, offering Marcus a polite smile. I hope your hand feels better, she said before walking away, leaving Marcus and his friends sitting at the table trying to piece together what had just happened. The afternoon brought new challenges as word of the lunch incident spread through the school's social networks.
Sarah found herself the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations, her status as the quiet new girl suddenly complicated by the mystery of what had occurred in the cafeteria. Some students looked at her with newfound respect, while others seemed wary of the girl who had somehow gotten the better of Marcus Webb.
In chemistry class, Sarah found herself partnered with Emma Rodriguez, a sophomore with bright eyes and an infectious smile who seemed genuinely excited to have someone new to talk to. Emma was petite and energetic with curly black hair and the kind of optimistic personality that hadn't yet been dimmed by high school politics. That was amazing what you did to Marcus at lunch, Emma whispered, as they set up their lab equipment. Nobody's ever stood up to him like that before. I didn't really do anything, Sarah replied, measuring chemicals with the precision of someone who had handled much more dangerous substances. He just hurt his hand somehow. Emma laughed quietly. Right, and I'm secretly a NASA scientist. Look, I don't know what kind of martial arts you know, but whatever it was awesome. Marcus has been bullying people since freshman year, and the teachers never do anything about it because his dad donates money to the school. Sarah paused in her measurements, a flicker of interest crossing her features.
He's been doing this for a while. Years, Emma confirmed, her voice dropping to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. He targets the quiet kids, the ones without many friends who won't fight back.
Takes their lunch money, makes them do his homework, basically treats them like personal servants. And if anyone complains, his friends back him up and say it never happened.
The information clicked into place in Sarah's mind like pieces of an intelligence puzzle. Marcus wasn't just a random bully. He was running a systematic operation based on intimidation and the exploitation of power imbalances.
It was exactly the kind of predatory behavior she had been trained to recognize and neutralize, just in a different context than she was used to. Their chemistry experiment proceeded smoothly. Emma chattering about school events and local gossip while Sarah listened with half her attention. The other half was focused on processing what she had learned about the social dynamics at Jefferson High, filing away details that might prove relevant later. After school, Sarah walked to the parking lot where her foster mother, Janet Mitchell, waited in a blue Honda Civic. Janet was a kind woman in her 40s who worked as a nurse at the base hospital and had opened her home to Sarah as part of her cover identity. The arrangement was temporary, just long enough for Sarah to complete her mission and transition back to whatever came next. "How was your first day, sweetie?" Janet asked as Sarah climbed into the passenger seat. "Fine," Sarah replied, buckling her seatbelt. "Just the usual new school stuff." Janet smiled and pulled out of the parking lot, chatting about her own day while Sarah stared out the window at the passing suburban landscape. The normalcy of it all still felt surreal after months of living in war zones and training facilities. Here, the biggest dangers were social embarrassment and pop quizzes, not IEDs and sniper fire. But as they drove through the quiet streets lined with maple trees and modest houses, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jefferson High had its own battles to fight. Marcus Webb and his systematic bullying operation were just the beginning. There were always predators looking for victims, whether they wore enemy uniforms or Letterman jackets. That evening, Sarah sat at the desk in her temporary bedroom, supposedly working on homework assignments while actually reviewing the mental notes she had taken throughout the day. Her training had taught her to treat every environment as a potential mission zone, to identify threats and opportunities with equal precision. Jefferson High School was about to become very interesting. Marcus Webb had built his reputation on the fear of students who had nowhere else to turn. He had never encountered someone who had been trained to turn fear into a weapon, who had learned to see every situation as a tactical problem with multiple solutions. Sarah Mitchell was about to give him an education he would never forget. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test the boundaries between her two identities. But tonight, she allowed herself a small smile as she closed her notebook and prepared for bed. High school was going to be easier than she had expected. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's first encounter with Marcus Webb, and Jefferson High had settled into an uneasy rhythm around her presence. She had successfully maintained her cover as a quiet military transfer student while carefully observing the complex ecosystem of teenage politics that governed daily life at the school.
What she discovered during those weeks of patient surveillance would have impressed her former commanding officers with its thoroughness and strategic value.
Marcus Webb's operation was more sophisticated than she had initially realized. He didn't just randomly target vulnerable students. He had developed a systematic approach that maximized profit while minimizing risk of adult intervention. His victims were carefully selected based on specific criteria: students with absent or working parents who wouldn't notice missing money, kids with social anxiety who were unlikely to report incidents, and transfer students who hadn't yet established support networks. Sarah documented his methods with the same precision she had once used to track enemy movement patterns. Marcus employed a rotation system, never hitting the same victim more than twice a week, to avoid creating obvious patterns. He used different locations throughout the school: empty hallways during class changes, secluded areas behind the gymnasium, even the school parking lot after hours. His 3 lieutenants, Jake Morrison, Tony Silva, and Derek Chen, each handled different aspects of the operation like a well-oiled criminal enterprise. Jake Morrison was the muscle, a thick-necked football player who intimidated victims through physical presence and barely veiled threats. Tony Silva handled intelligence, identifying new targets and gathering information about their schedules, habits, and weaknesses. Derek Chen managed logistics, collecting payments and keeping track of who owed what. Together, they had created a shadow economy within Jefferson High that generated hundreds of dollars each month while terrorizing dozens of students. The faculty remained largely oblivious to what was happening under their noses. Marcus was careful to maintain excellent grades and participate in school activities that gave him positive visibility with teachers and administrators. He volunteered for school events, participated in student government, and cultivated relationships with influential staff members. When complaints did surface, they were quickly dismissed as personality conflicts or typical teenage drama. Sarah's investigation had also revealed the human cost of Marcus's enterprise. She had identified at least 15 regular victims, students whose academic performance, social behavior, and overall well-being showed clear signs of ongoing stress and intimidation. There was Michael Chen, a sophomore with anxiety issues who had started skipping meals to save money for Marcus's weekly demands. Jessica Torres, a freshman from a single-parent household who had been selling her textbooks to meet payment deadlines. David Kim, a junior who had developed insomnia and was failing 3 classes because he spent his nights terrified about facing Marcus the next day. Each victim represented a tactical intelligence asset, a potential ally in the operation Sarah was beginning to plan. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of Marcus's network and identify any weaknesses that could be exploited. The breakthrough came during a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. Sarah was reviewing her Spanish homework in the library when she noticed Tony Silva sitting at a computer terminal 2 tables away. He was supposedly working on a history research paper, but Sarah's trained eye caught him repeatedly glancing toward the entrance and checking his phone at precise 5-minute intervals. Classic surveillance behavior. She pretended to search for a book while positioning herself with a clear view of his screen. Tony wasn't researching the Civil War. He was maintaining a detailed spreadsheet that contained names, payment schedules, and personal information about dozens of students. The document was labeled Customer Database and included columns for weekly amount, payment history, reliability score, and risk assessment. Sarah memorized as much of the information as possible before Tony closed the laptop and left the library. The sophistication of his record-keeping system confirmed her suspicions that Marcus's operation was far more organized and extensive than anyone realized. This wasn't just teenage bullying. It was systematic extortion with the kind of operational security that would have been impressive in an actual criminal organization. That afternoon, Sarah made her first direct intervention. She had been tracking the movements of one of Marcus's regular victims, a quiet freshman named Alex Peterson, who was consistently targeted because he received disability payments that made him a reliable source of income. Alex was small for his age, struggled with a stutter that made him reluctant to report problems, and had no friends to provide support or protection. Sarah positioned herself near Alex's locker during the period change, pretending to struggle with her own combination lock, while monitoring the hallway traffic. Right on schedule, Jake Morrison appeared and began walking toward Alex with the predatory confidence of someone who had never faced serious resistance. "Hey, Peterson," Jake called out, his voice carrying the casual menace that had intimidated dozens of students over the years. "You got something for me?" Alex's hands shook as he fumbled with his backpack, clearly terrified but unable to see any alternative to compliance. He had been paying Marcus's crew for 3 months, and the weekly demands had escalated from $5 to $20 as they recognized his reliability as a victim. Sarah closed her locker and began walking toward her next class, timing her movement to intersect with Jake's approach. As she passed behind him, she stumbled slightly and bumped into his shoulder, causing him to step sideways and lose his aggressive positioning relative to Alex.
"Oh, I'm so sorry," Sarah said with genuine-sounding embarrassment. "I'm still getting used to navigating these crowded hallways." The interruption broke the psychological dynamic Jake had been establishing.
Alex looked up in surprise, suddenly aware that he wasn't alone and isolated. Other students were moving through the hallway, teachers were visible in nearby doorways, and the intimidation tactic that relied on creating a sense of helpless isolation had been disrupted. Jake scowled at Sarah but couldn't escalate the situation without drawing unwanted attention from passing adults. "Watch where you're going, new girl," he muttered before stalking away, leaving Alex standing by his locker with a confused but relieved expression. Sarah continued to her next class without acknowledging what had happened, but she had gained valuable intelligence about Marcus's operation. His crew relied heavily on psychological intimidation and the creation of isolated encounters where victims felt they had no choice but to comply. Disrupting that isolation, even briefly, was enough to neutralize their tactical advantage. Over the following week, Sarah implemented a series of similar interventions. She began timing her movements through the school to coincide with known collection times, creating unexpected interruptions that prevented Marcus's crew from conducting business as usual. She would stop to ask teachers questions in hallways where intimidation was typically conducted, organize impromptu study sessions in areas that were usually deserted, and even convince Emma Rodriguez to start a lunchtime chess club that met in spaces Marcus had previously controlled. The effects were subtle but measurable.
Victims began to realize that they weren't as isolated as they had believed, and Marcus's crew found their operations increasingly disrupted by seemingly random interruptions. Collection rates dropped and several victims began showing signs of increased confidence as the psychological pressure that had kept them compliant began to ease. Marcus himself began to take notice of the changes.
During lunch on a Monday in late November, Sarah observed him having an intense conversation with his 3 lieutenants at their usual table. His body language showed frustration and anger, while Tony Silva was gesturing toward his phone in a way that suggested they were discussing operational problems.
Sarah couldn't hear their conversation from across the cafeteria, but she didn't need to. Their behavioral patterns told the story clearly enough. Marcus was realizing that his carefully constructed system was being systematically undermined, but he couldn't identify the source of the problem. The disruptions appeared random, the interventions looked accidental, and there was no obvious pattern that would point to deliberate sabotage. It was exactly the kind of psychological pressure that Sarah had been trained to apply against enemy networks. Create enough uncertainty and paranoia, and the organization would begin to turn on itself, while revealing weaknesses that could be exploited.
The escalation came on a Wednesday afternoon during the last week of November. Sarah was walking toward the parking lot after school when she heard raised voices coming from behind the maintenance building.
Her tactical training kicked in automatically, and she approached the disturbance with the silent movement techniques that had kept her alive during night reconnaissance missions. Marcus had cornered Jessica Torres, the freshman who had been selling textbooks to meet his demands.
Jessica was crying and trying to explain that her mother had lost her job and there was no money for payments anymore. Marcus was not interested in her explanations. "I don't care about your sob story," Marcus was saying, his voice harsh with frustration from weeks of declining collections. "You owe me $60, and I'm not leaving here without it." "Please," Jessica sobbed.
"I'll get it next week, I promise. My mom is looking for work and maybe nothing." Marcus cut her off. "You pay now, or I make sure everyone at school knows about your little arrangement. Think your new friends will stick around when they find out you've been holding out on them?"
Sarah assessed the situation with clinical precision.
Marcus was using escalating intimidation tactics because his usual methods had been disrupted. Jessica was in genuine distress, and the threat of social humiliation was being used as a weapon to extract compliance. The encounter was taking place in an isolated area with no witnesses except for Derek Chen, who was standing guard at the corner of the building. This was exactly the kind of scenario her training had prepared her for. A predator exploiting a vulnerable victim in a situation where conventional help was not available. Sarah made her decision. She approached the building from the opposite side, moving with the silent footwork that had allowed her to infiltrate enemy positions without detection. Derek Chen was focused on watching for teachers or administrators, not for threats approaching from unexpected angles. Sarah reached the corner where he stood guard and tapped him gently on the shoulder.
Derek spun around in surprise, his face showing confusion when he saw Sarah's friendly smile.
"Oh, hi, Derek," she said in a conversational tone. "I was looking for the drama club meeting. Do you know if they're still using the music room on Wednesdays?" The question was innocent enough, but it had the desired effect. Derek glanced nervously toward the corner where Marcus was conducting his business, clearly unsure how to handle an unexpected interruption to their security protocols. I don't know about any drama club," Derek stammered. "That's okay," Sarah replied cheerfully. "I'll just go ask Mr. Peterson. I think I saw him heading toward his classroom." She turned as if to walk toward the main building, then paused and looked back. "Hey, isn't that Jessica Torres around the corner? I was supposed to give her my notes from English class." Derek's face went pale as he realized that Sarah had not only disrupted their security but had also identified their current victim. His training in Marcus's operation had not prepared him for this kind of tactical problem. "Maybe you should come back later," Derek said weakly. "Oh, that's okay," Sarah said, already walking around the corner. "This will just take a second." She rounded the building to find Marcus standing too close to Jessica, using his height and bulk to create a sense of physical intimidation. Jessica was backed against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her backpack like a shield. "Hi, Jessica," Sarah called out brightly, as if she had just encountered a friend during a casual walk. "There you are! I've been looking everywhere for you." Marcus spun toward the new arrival, his face showing a mixture of anger and confusion. This was the second time the new girl had interfered with his operations, and he was beginning to suspect that her appearances weren't as accidental as they seemed. "This is a private conversation," Marcus said, his voice carrying the menace that usually sent other students scurrying away. "Oh, I'm sorry," Sarah replied with apparent sincerity.
I didn't realize you two were talking. Jessica, just wanted to give you my English notes like I promised. Mrs. Patterson said the test is going to be really hard. She approached Jessica and handed her a folded piece of paper from her backpack. To Marcus, it looked like class notes, but Jessica would discover later that it contained a simple message. You don't have to face this alone. Find me tomorrow at lunch. The interruption had completely disrupted the psychological dynamic that Marcus had been building. Jessica was no longer isolated and helpless. There was a witness present, someone who seemed to care about her welfare, and the sense of inescapable intimidation had been broken. Marcus realized that pressing forward with his demands would now carry significant risks. Sarah was clearly not afraid of him, and her presence made it impossible to use the kind of escalating threats that usually produced compliance. He had no choice but to retreat and regroup. We'll finish our conversation later, Torres, Marcus said, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. Actually, Sarah said in the same friendly tone, Jessica and I were about to walk to the library together. We're working on a project for Mrs. Chen's class. She turned to Jessica with an encouraging smile. Ready to go? Jessica nodded mutely, still confused about what was happening, but smart enough to recognize a rescue when it appeared. Son, Sarah linked arms with her in a gesture that was both supportive and strategically sound. It would be much harder for Marcus to separate them or continue his intimidation while they were physically connected. As they walked away together, Sarah could feel Marcus's eyes boring into her back. She had now directly interfered with his operations twice, and there was no way he could continue to dismiss her actions as coincidental. The invisible war that had been building between them for weeks was about to become very visible indeed.
Thank you.
Jessica whispered as they reached the main building.
Don't mention it, Sarah replied quietly.
But we need to talk. That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary bedroom reviewing the tactical situation. Her interventions had been successful in disrupting Marcus's operations and protecting individual victims, but they had also revealed her involvement to someone who was now motivated to retaliate. The next phase would require more careful planning and potentially more direct action. She opened her notebook and began writing down everything she knew about Marcus Webb, his crew, and their methods. Tomorrow, she would begin recruiting allies and building the network she would need for the final phase of her operation.
Marcus Webb thought he was fighting a high school student.
He had no idea he was about to face someone who had been trained to dismantle networks exactly like his. The real battle was just beginning. The first week of December brought an unexpected cold snap to Jefferson High, and with it Marcus Webb's declaration of war against Sarah Mitchell. The cafeteria buzzed with nervous energy as students whispered about the confrontation everyone knew was coming. Marcus had spent the weekend planning his response to Sarah's continued interference, and Monday morning brought the opening salvo of what he intended to be her complete social destruction. It started during first period when Sarah discovered that someone had broken into her locker and scattered her belongings across the hallway floor. Her textbooks had been torn, her notebooks soaked with what smelled like energy drinks, and a crude message spray-painted on the inside of her locker door. The vandalism was clearly meant to send a message, but it also revealed something important about Marcus's mindset. He was angry enough to abandon the careful operational security that had protected his enterprise for years. Principal Harrison was sympathetic but ultimately helpless. Without witnesses or concrete evidence pointing to specific perpetrators, he could only offer to assign Sarah a new locker and suggest she be more careful about her combination security. The subtext was clear. This was being treated as a prank rather than the escalation of systematic intimidation that Sarah recognized it to be. By lunchtime, phase 2 of Marcus's campaign had begun. Sarah entered the cafeteria to find that every seat at every table was mysteriously saved for other students. Even Emma Rodriguez, her closest friend at Jefferson High, looked uncomfortable and avoided eye contact when Sarah approached their usual spot. The social isolation was precise and comprehensive, clearly the result of threats made to anyone who might offer her support. Sarah purchased her lunch and stood in the center of the cafeteria with her tray, aware that dozens of students were watching to see how she would respond to being completely ostracized. The psychological pressure was intense, exactly the kind of social warfare that had broken other students who had dared to challenge Marcus's authority. Instead of showing distress or retreating in defeat, Sarah smiled and walked confidently to an empty table near the windows. She sat down and began eating her sandwich as if nothing unusual had happened, occasionally looking up to offer friendly nods to students who were staring at her. Her body language conveyed complete calm and self-assurance, suggesting that the isolation was her choice rather than something being imposed upon her. The effect on the watching crowd was significant. Students had expected to see her humiliated and defeated, confirmation that challenging Marcus Webb led only to social suicide. Instead, they saw someone who appeared completely unaffected by the same treatment that had reduced other victims to tears and transfer requests. Marcus himself watched from across the room, his frustration evident in the tight line of his jaw and the way his hands gripped his lunch tray. His opening gambit had failed to produce the desired psychological breakdown, and Sarah's composure was actually making him look ineffective in front of his own followers. The situation escalated further that afternoon during gym class. Sarah had been looking forward to physical education as a break from the social battlefield. But Marcus had anticipated this and arranged for Jake Morrison to be her assigned partner for wrestling practice. The pairing seemed random to Coach Williams, who had no way of knowing that he was unwittingly facilitating another phase of Marcus's campaign. Jake was 6 inches taller than Sarah and outweighed her by at least 40 pounds. He was also angry about the disruption of their collection operations and eager to prove his loyalty to Marcus by delivering a humiliating defeat to the girl who had caused so many problems. As they faced each other on the wrestling mat, his intentions were written clearly across his face. "This is going to be fun," Jake muttered as they assumed starting positions. Sarah said nothing, but her mind automatically shifted into the combat assessment mode that had kept her alive during hand-to-hand training with special operations instructors who had tried to kill her as part of her preparation. Jake Morrison was strong and aggressive, but he was also predictable and undisciplined. His anger made him sloppy, and his assumption of easy victory made him careless. Coach Williams blew his whistle, and Jake lunged forward with the kind of straightforward attack that worked against intimidated opponents who were already defeated psychologically. He expected Sarah to panic, to struggle ineffectively while he demonstrated his physical dominance in front of the entire class. What happened instead would be talked about in the locker rooms and hallways of Jefferson High for months afterward. Sarah moved with fluid precision that seemed to defy physics, redirecting Jake's aggressive momentum in a way that sent him tumbling across the mat while she remained perfectly balanced. To the watching students, it looked like Jake had simply tripped over his own feet during what should have been a routine takedown. "Whoa, be careful there, Jake," Sarah said with apparent concern as he picked himself up, confusion and embarrassment replacing his earlier confidence. Jake's face reddened as nervous laughter rippled through the watching students. He attacked again, this time with more caution but also more determination to prove that his first failure had been a fluke. Sarah waited until he was committed to his approach, then used his own strength against him in a way that left him flat on his back staring up at the gymnasium ceiling.
Maybe we should take it a little easier,
Sarah suggested helpfully. "I know wrestling can be tricky when you're not used to different styles." By the third takedown, it was clear to everyone watching that something extraordinary was happening. Jake Morrison, who had dominated every opponent he had ever faced in gym class, was being systematically dismantled by a girl who weighed half what he did. And she was doing it while maintaining a cheerful, helpful attitude that made his increasing desperation look even more pathetic. Coach Williams, sensing that the situation had moved beyond normal wrestling practice, blew his whistle and called time. "Good work, everyone," he announced. "Morrison, Mitchell, nice demonstration of different techniques." Jake limped off the mat, his reputation in tatters and his confidence shattered. The other students looked at Sarah with a mixture of awe and wariness, suddenly realizing that the quiet new girl was far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. Marcus Webb, who had been watching from the bleachers during his study hall period, finally understood that he was not dealing with an ordinary opponent. Sarah Mitchell had just publicly humiliated his primary enforcer while making it look effortless and accidental. This was not the behavior of a typical transfer student. This was someone with professional-level training in combat and psychological warfare. That evening, Marcus held an emergency meeting with his crew in Derek Chen's basement. The 4 boys sat around a card table covered with energy drinks and notebooks, trying to understand how their carefully constructed empire was being dismantled by a single teenage girl. "She's not normal," Jake insisted, still nursing bruises from the afternoon's wrestling practice. "Nobody moves like that without serious training. I'm talking military-level stuff." "She's just a military brat," Tony argued, though his voice lacked conviction. "Her dad probably taught her some basic self-defense." "Basic self-defense doesn't do what I saw today," Derek interjected. "She made Jake look like a complete amateur, and she did it without even breaking a sweat." Marcus listened to his lieutenants argue while studying the intelligence they had gathered about Sarah Mitchell. Her transfer paperwork listed 3 different schools in 2 years, all connected to military bases. Her emergency contact was listed as a foster mother rather than biological parents. Her academic record showed excellent grades but no extracurricular activities or social connections at previous schools. The pattern suggested someone whose real background was being carefully hidden, whose presence at Jefferson High served a purpose beyond simple education. Marcus was beginning to suspect that Sarah Mitchell's arrival in his territory had not been coincidental. "We need to escalate," Marcus declared, cutting off the debate among his followers.
Whatever game she's playing, we end it now. Tomorrow, we make it clear that nobody challenges us and gets away with it. But Sarah was already 3 steps ahead of his planning.
That same evening, she sat in her bedroom conducting a secure video conference with Commander Patricia Hayes, her former handler who is now stationed at the Pentagon. The conversation was encrypted and routed through multiple secure servers, making it untraceable by anyone who might be monitoring communications at Jefferson High. "How's your readjustment to civilian life progressing?" Commander Hayes asked, though her tone suggested this was more than a casual check-in. "There have been some complications," Sarah replied carefully. "The social dynamics here are more complex than anticipated. I've encountered an organized network that's engaging in systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals."
Commander Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying you found a security threat at a suburban high school?" "I'm saying I've found a criminal organization that's operating with impunity because adults in authority positions don't recognize the sophistication of their methods," Sarah corrected.
"The leader has created a protection racket that generates significant revenue while causing measurable psychological damage to victims. The operational security would be impressive if it were being conducted by actual professionals. And you've decided to intervene. My cover identity requires me to attend this school for several more months. Allowing the criminal network to continue operating would compromise the safety and well-being of multiple innocent civilians under my protection." Commander Hayes was quiet for several seconds, and Sarah could see her weighing the complexities of a situation that existed in the gray area between Sarah's official mission and her personal sense of responsibility. "What do you need?" the commander finally asked. "Permission to utilize specialized skills and training in a civilian law enforcement context," Sarah replied formally, "and access to resources that might help document evidence for local authorities." "Consider it granted." "But Sarah, remember that you're supposed to be learning how to be a normal teenager, not conducting counterintelligence operations against high school bullies."
Understood, ma'am.
"But sometimes protecting innocent people requires skills that normal teenagers don't possess." The next morning, Sarah implemented the final phase of her plan against Marcus Webb's organization. She had spent weeks gathering intelligence, identifying weaknesses, and preparing countermeasures. Now it was time to dismantle their entire network in a way that would ensure they could never rebuild it. She started by arriving at school early and placing small wireless cameras in strategic locations throughout the building. The devices were military-grade surveillance equipment that Commander Hayes had arranged to be delivered through encrypted channels. They were virtually undetectable and capable of recording high-definition video that would provide irrefutable evidence of Marcus's crimes. At 8:30 a.m., just as first period was beginning, Sarah triggered the first phase of her operation. She had sent anonymous text messages to 5 of Marcus's regular victims, each containing a simple message. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Meet me in the library during lunch. Bring anyone else who wants this to stop." By lunchtime, word had spread throughout the school's informal communication networks. Students who had suffered under Marcus's reign of terror began to realize that they weren't alone, that someone was finally offering them a chance to fight back. When Sarah arrived at the library, she found 12 students waiting for her. Victims who had been paying protection money, doing homework assignments, and living in constant fear. "I know all of you have been hurt by Marcus Webb and his friends," Sarah began, speaking quietly to avoid attracting attention from the librarian. "I know you've been told that there's nothing you can do about it, that no one will believe you if you report what's happening." Michael Chen, the sophomore who had been skipping meals to pay Marcus's demands, spoke up first. "Even if we tell someone, Marcus's dad donates money to the school. The teachers love him. Who's going to believe us over him?"
I have evidence, Sarah replied simply. Video recordings of collections being made, documentation of threats, financial records that prove the systematic nature of their operation.
"But I need all of you to be willing to come forward and tell your stories to someone who can actually do something about this." She explained that she had arranged for Detective Maria Santos, a juvenile crime specialist from the local police department, to meet with them after school. Detective Santos had extensive experience with teenage criminal enterprises and would take their allegations seriously, especially when supported by the kind of documentation that Sarah had gathered. The meeting in the library was interrupted when Marcus Webb himself appeared, flanked by his 3 lieutenants and looking ready for a final confrontation. The 12 victims scattered immediately, their ingrained fear overriding any momentary courage they might have felt. But Sarah remained seated at the library table, calmly closing the notebook where she had been writing down contact information for each victim.
She looked up at Marcus with the same neutral expression she had maintained throughout their entire conflict. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of barely controlled anger that preceded violence. "I agree," Sarah replied, standing and gathering her belongings, "but not here." She led the group out of the library and toward the empty hallway behind the gymnasium, the same location where Marcus had been conducting many of his collection operations. The symbolism was intentional, and Marcus recognized it even if he didn't understand its full significance. "You've been interfering with my business for months," Marcus said once they were alone. "I don't know who you think you are, but it ends today." "Your business," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call systematically terrorizing children and extorting money from families who can barely afford to put food on the table?" "I call it free enterprise," Marcus shot back. "Supply and demand. I supply protection, they demand to be left alone."
Basic economics. "What you're describing is a federal crime," Sarah said matter-of-factly.
"Specifically, it's racketeering under the RICO Act. The systematic use of intimidation and threats to extract money from victims creates a pattern of criminal behavior that carries serious penalties."
Marcus laughed harshly. "Listen to yourself. You sound like some kind of cop or something. Newsflash, Mitchell, you're just another high school student, and high school students don't get to play detective."
"You're right," Sarah agreed. "High school students don't get to play detective, but they do get to report crimes to actual detectives who have the authority to investigate and prosecute criminal organizations." She pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a text message thread with Detective Santos confirming their after-school meeting and indicating that multiple witnesses were prepared to provide sworn statements about ongoing criminal activity at Jefferson High. Marcus's confident expression faltered as he realized the implications of what Sarah was showing him. This wasn't just about school politics or teenage drama anymore. She had elevated their conflict to the level of actual law enforcement involvement. "You can't do this," Derek said desperately. "We're all minors. Juvenile records get sealed, right? This can't really hurt us." "Actually, it can," Sarah replied with the clinical precision of someone who had studied criminal law as part of her counterintelligence training. "Racketeering charges can be prosecuted in adult court depending on the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise. And based on the financial records Tony has been keeping, your operation has generated enough revenue to qualify for enhanced penalties." Tony's face went pale as he realized that his careful documentation of their crimes had created a paper trail that could be used against them in court. "How do you know about Tony's records?" Marcus demanded. "Because I've been conducting surveillance on all of you for weeks," Sarah answered honestly. "I know your methods, your schedules, your victims, and your weaknesses. I know that Jake injured his shoulder during football season and it still bothers him during cold weather. I know that Derek gets nervous when he's lying and always touches his nose. I know that Tony keeps backup files of everything on his laptop because he's afraid of losing data." She turned to address Marcus directly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed far beyond her apparent age. "And I know that you're not nearly as smart as you think you are. You've been running a criminal organization with the operational security of children playing at being gangsters. You've left evidence everywhere, witnesses who can identify you, and financial records that document your crimes in precise detail." Marcus was beginning to understand that he had gravely underestimated his opponent, but his pride and anger prevented him from backing down. "Even if all that's true," he said, "nobody's going to believe that some transfer student took down our whole operation." "Who are you really, Mitchell?" "Because you're sure as hell not just some military brat." Sarah studied his face for several seconds, weighing how much truth she could reveal without compromising her cover identity or her actual mission. "I'm someone who was trained to identify and neutralize threats to innocent people," she said finally. "I'm someone who has experience dealing with predators who think they can hurt vulnerable victims without consequences, and I'm someone who always completes her missions." The weight of her words settled over the group like a physical presence. Jake, Tony, and Derek were all staring at her with a mixture of fear and confusion, finally beginning to understand that they had been in a fight they were never equipped to win. Marcus made one final attempt to salvage his authority and intimidate Sarah into backing down. He stepped forward aggressively, using his height and bulk to try to create the same psychological pressure that had worked against so many previous victims. "Mission or no mission," he snarled. "You're still just one girl, and there are 4 of us. Maybe it's time you learned what happens to people who don't know their place." Sarah didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show any sign that his proximity or threats had any effect on her whatsoever. She looked up into his face with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout their entire conflict. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you have no idea who you're threatening."
What happened next lasted approximately 15 seconds, but it effectively ended Marcus Webb's reign of terror at Jefferson High School forever. Marcus reached towards Sarah as if to grab her shoulders, intending to use physical intimidation to finally break through her impossible composure. Instead, he found himself flat on his back in the hallway, staring up at the ceiling while trying to figure out how he had gotten there. Sarah stood exactly where she had been before, her hands at her sides, looking as if she hadn't moved at all. Jake rushed forward to help his leader, but he too ended up on the ground within seconds, his earlier wrestling practice having taught him nothing about how to counter Sarah's actual combat skills. Tony and Derek backed away against the wall, smart enough to recognize that they were completely outmatched.
Sarah looked down at Marcus, who was struggling to catch his breath and understand what had just happened to him. The meeting with Detective Santos is at 4 o'clock in Conference Room B. She informed him in the same conversational tone she might use to discuss homework assignments.
I strongly recommend that you and your friends attend. Cooperation with law enforcement tends to result in more favorable treatment than forcing officers to track down uncooperative suspects. She gathered her backpack and walked away, leaving Marcus and Jake on the hallway floor while Tony and Derek helped them to their feet. At 4:15 p.m. that afternoon, Detective Maria Santos concluded the most comprehensive investigation of juvenile criminal activity she had encountered in 15 years with the local police department. 12 victims had provided detailed statements about systematic intimidation and extortion. Sarah Mitchell had supplied hours of video evidence documenting crimes in progress. Tony Silva's laptop contained financial records that proved the scope and duration of the criminal enterprise. Marcus Webb, Jake Morrison, Tony Silva, and Derek Chen were arrested and charged with multiple counts of extortion, conspiracy, and racketeering. So, the sophistication of their operation and the amount of money involved meant that some charges would be prosecuted in adult court despite their ages. The story made headlines in local newspapers and sparked a broader investigation into school security and anti-bullying policies throughout the district. Principal Harrison faced serious questions about how such an extensive criminal operation had flourished under his administration without detection. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell sat in the same cafeteria where she had first encountered Marcus Webb, eating lunch with Emma Rodriguez and several other students who had become her friends after the truth about Marcus's operation became public knowledge. The social atmosphere at Jefferson High had changed dramatically. Students who had lived in fear for months were finally able to relax, concentrate on their studies, and enjoy their teenage years without the constant threat of victimization. I still can't believe you took down Marcus Webb's entire crew by yourself, Emma said, shaking her head in amazement.
It's like something out of an action movie. I just documented what was already happening and made sure the right people knew about it, Sarah replied modestly. The victims were the brave ones for being willing to come forward and tell their stories. But how did you know to look for all that evidence?
How did you know exactly what kind of documentation Detective Santos would need? Sarah smiled and took a sip of her chocolate milk. I guess I watch a lot of crime shows on TV.
Emma laughed, accepting the explanation even though she suspected there was much more to the story than Sarah would ever reveal. That evening, Sarah had her final video conference with Commander Hayes regarding the situation at Jefferson High School.
Local law enforcement reports indicate that your intervention was highly effective, the commander noted with approval. The criminal organization has been completely dismantled, and multiple victims are receiving counseling and support services.
Your transition to civilian life appears to be proceeding successfully. The school psychologist report indicates that you've formed positive social relationships and are adapting well to a normal educational environment.
Oh. Sarah nodded, though she wondered if her life would ever truly be normal in the way that other teenagers understood the concept. There is one more thing, Commander Hayes continued. We've received reports about similar criminal networks operating at other schools in different parts of the country. Students who have the skills and training to identify and neutralize these threats could provide valuable service to their communities.
Sarah understood the implication immediately. Her mission at Jefferson High had been personal, but it had also demonstrated the potential for applying specialized skills to protect innocent civilians in environments where traditional law enforcement had limited visibility.
Are you offering me another assignment? She asked.
I'm offering you a choice, Commander Hayes replied.
You've earned the right to pursue whatever future you want. College, career, normal life. But if you're interested in continuing to use your unique capabilities to help people who can't help themselves, Sarah looked out her bedroom window at the quiet suburban street where she had spent the last few months learning to be a teenager.
The normalcy was appealing in many ways, but she also knew that there were other schools, other Marcus Webbs, other victims who needed someone willing to fight for them.
I'll need to maintain my cover identity as a regular student,
She said finally.
of course, and I'll need full operational support for evidence gathering and coordination with local law enforcement.
Agreed. And I want to finish my senior year at Jefferson High. These people have become my friends and I don't want to abandon them.
Commander Hayes smiled. I think that can be arranged. Welcome to your new mission, Agent Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell closed her laptop and prepared for bed, but her mind was already thinking about the future. Tomorrow, she would wake up as a normal high school student, worried about homework assignments and college applications. But when the time came when innocent people needed protection from predators who thought they were untouchable, she would be ready to become something else entirely. The silent weapon was no longer underestimated or under attack. She had found her purpose, and it was just the beginning of a much larger mission to protect the vulnerable from those who would prey upon them.
In high schools across the country, bullies and criminals who thought they were untouchable had no idea that their days of operating with impunity were numbered. Sarah Mitchell had graduated from Jefferson High's most dangerous new girl to America's most effective undercover protector.
The prey had become the predator and the hunt was just beginning.